Blackwood was a forgotten town, tucked deep into the Maine woods where the air hung thick with mist and secrets. Once a thriving mill town, now it was a shell of its former self, rotting clapboard houses, a gas station that always seemed closed, and a diner that smelled of burnt coffee and despair. Most who lived there either couldn't leave or didn't want to. But for Annie Calloway, returning to Blackwood wasn't a choice. It was an obligation. Annie's father, Hank Calloway, had died suddenly. A heart attack, the coroner said, though Annie suspected his lifelong affair with whiskey and Marlboros had helped things along. She hadn't spoken to him in years, not since she left for Boston at 18, vowing never to set foot in that cursed town again. But now, she was back, if only to settle his affairs and sell the dilapidated family home. The house was as she remembered, 2 stories of peeling paint and creaking floors, surrounded by an overgrown yard that seemed to swallow the light. The forest loomed behind it, a dark wall of pines that whispered when the wind blew. Annie hated those woods. They were the backdrop of every nightmare she'd ever had, the ones where the shadows moved, the whispers called her name, and the air smelled like rust. As she unlocked the front door, she hesitated. The house seemed alive in a way that made her skin crawl, as if it had been waiting for her. The air inside was stale, tinged with the faint, acrid smell of cigarettes and something else she couldn't place. "Home sweet home," she muttered, stepping inside. The door groaned shut behind her. That night, Annie sorted through her father's belongings. Most of it was junk, old tools, faded photographs, stacks of newspapers, but then she found the journal. It was leather-bound, its edges worn smooth by years of handling. Her father hadn't been the type to keep a diary, so she opened it with curiosity. The first few pages were mundane, notes about the weather, repairs he'd made to the house. But as she read further, the entries grew darker. March 3rd, the noises are getting worse. Scratching at the windows, footsteps in the hall. I told myself it was the wind, but now I'm not so sure. March 8th, saw something in the woods today. A shadow, but not a man. It moved too fast, and the way it looked at me. God help me. March 15th, I hear them whispering at night. They know my name. Annie's stomach churned. Her father had been a drinker, sure, but this was something else. She closed the journal and shoved it into her bag. That night, the whispers started. It began softly, just a faint murmur that could have been the wind. But as the hours dragged on, it grew louder, more distinct. Annie lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, as voices whispered her name from the walls. "Annie, come outside." She bolted upright, heart pounding. The room was dark, but the whispers didn't stop. Gathering every ounce of courage she had, she turned on the lamp. The light banished the darkness, and with it, the whispers. Shaking, she made her way to the window. The forest stood silent and still, but then she saw it, a shadow moving between the trees, darker than the night around it. It stopped, turned, and for a moment, she could swear it was looking right at her. She slammed the curtains shut. The next morning, Annie drove into town, desperate for answers. At the diner, she found Martha, a woman who'd been her father's neighbor for years. Over a cup of bitter coffee, Annie told her about the journal and the whispers. Martha paled. "Your father wasn't crazy," she said. "The shadows are real. They've been here since before the town was built. People disappear in those woods, Annie. Always have." "What do they want?" Annie asked, her voice trembling. "No one knows," Martha said. "But once they notice you, they don't stop." That night, the whispers returned, louder than before. They called her name, beckoning her to the woods. Unable to bear it any longer, Annie grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside. "Leave me alone," she shouted into the darkness. The forest swallowed her voice, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, merging into a cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then she saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the trees, their shapes shifting and flickering like smoke. Their eyes, if you could call them that, glowed faintly, a sickly yellow light that seemed to pierce her soul. Annie tried to run, but the ground beneath her feet turned to shadows, pulling her down. She screamed, thrashing, as cold darkness enveloped her. The next morning, the town awoke to find Annie's car still parked in the driveway of her father's house, but she was nowhere to be seen. The locals whispered about the Calloway curse, about the shadows in the woods, but no one dared search for her. Months later, a hiker found her father's journal lying on a moss-covered rock deep in the forest. The last entry read, "They want her. They've always wanted her. God forgive me, I brought her back." Annie was never seen again, but on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right, the people of Blackwood swear they can hear her screams echoing from the forest. And the shadows, they're always watching.